Saddle up for another episode of Gunfighter Life, where we talk about guns, tactics, the right way, with God at the center, Judeo-Christian values, real-world first-hand experience. We talk about guns and gear and tactics, survival, hunting. What are we going to talk about today, specifically? We're going to talk about survival caliber math. Now, it's hard for me to get excited about math. Some people actually enjoy math. Some people pursue a career in math. I can tolerate math if it has to do with guns, blowing stuff up, things like that. Actually, perhaps the most math I ever did outside of school was probably blowing stuff up, as I was an assaultman in the Marine Corps, and that had to do a lot with explosives, and that had to do a lot with algebra, geometry, things like that. So I can tolerate the math if it has a cool outcome. Well, hopefully today's episode has a cool outcome, brought to you as always by Almighty God. Couldn't do anything without him, and a special help from the patrons. This has spawned out of a Patreon chat, as many of our episodes do, which you would know if you were a patron and in the chat. But one of the patrons really went out of the way and did some legwork and did some math research for this episode. A thanks to all the patrons that make this show better. And a special thanks today to Luke, because again, he really did a lot of work. He even went into power to weight ratios on some of these rounds. So let's get a little bit nerdy. Let's get a little bit mathematical today. But for those that don't like math, hopefully it still gets you excited. And for those of you that have kids that are into guns and hunting and shooting and physics and stuff like that, maybe you'll really, really like this episode. Or maybe this is a way to get them passionate about math. So there's often a great caliber debate. What's the best survival caliber? It's kind of like the Ford versus Chevy debate, or the blondes versus redheads debate, or whatever great debates there are in society. Rhodesian Ridgebacks versus Akitas. The right answer there is Rhodesian Ridgebacks. I got you, hamster. My dog is sitting right in front of me. Alexander Hamilton, Rhodesian Ridgeback extraordinaire. But there is a great caliber debate. There's a great handgun caliber debate, which we're not going to get into today. Maybe we'll tackle that at another point. 9mm versus 40 versus 45 ACP, and then what about the 357 SIG ad nausea? But the great survival caliber debate, specifically on single projectile weapons, we're going to talk about today. We're probably not going to get into the weeds on like a 410 versus a 20 versus a 12 gauge. But let's talk about survival rifle calibers. Let's get down to the nitty gritty. Probably the greatest debate is 308 versus 223, which is the better survival caliber. 308, 223, the AR guys are like, it's all about the lightweight, high velocity. It turns into a buzzsaw inside the chest cavity. It slices, it dices, you can carry a ton of it. The 308 guys are like, the 223 may be suitable for miniature poodles, maybe for a prairie dog. If you have to, it'll take a coyote, but really it's around suitable for adolescent teen girls. And I'm being hyperbolic there on both sides, but you get that's kind of the thought behind both. So let us tackle those two calibers first. Now, an obvious elephant in the room is that the military, for their basic issue infantry rifle, went away from the 7.62 NATO, or the 7.62x51, or in civilian nomenclature and or more common loadings, 308 Winchester. They went from that to 5.56 or 223, depending on which civilian or military loading you're talking about, but let's not get that far in the weeds. They went from 308 to 223, or from 7.62, 51 to 5.56. They did that because they can carry more weight. You might think, well, there you go. Argument solved. And if you're on that side of the fence, you might use that as your primary argument. But here's another. The military, I think, since the adoption of the 5.56 has been a little bit lackluster. They have not been super impressed with that round. In fact, I was not super impressed with that round in my service. I served in the infantry. My primary MOS assaultman in the Marine Corps. I didn't do the bio today, but you probably know I did a couple of combat tours and was an urban warfare instructor for the Marine Corps. Also served in the U.S. Army, full-time and part-time National Guard, primary MOS infantry. But I think in our 20-plus year, and even more if you add up a bunch of side conflicts, but especially the 20-year war on terror, I guess, whatever you want to call it, I think we were a little bit lackluster. We were a little bit less than impressed with the performance of 5.56, which is why you see this swing back to what I would consider not even an intermediate, but a full-powered rifle cartridge. If you look at the energy, I mean, you might say that it's somehow a game changer, but other than the fact that it's loaded to hotter pressures, it's basically a 270 in a short action. You're getting into full-powered rifle territory again, closer, more akin to the thing they went away from, the 7.62 by 51 NATO. So the guys on that side are going to use that argument. But here's just a thing. You can carry more. Let's say that, because you got to carry more, survival's not all about guns and knives and body armor. There's a lot more mundane stuff that is more crucial to your survival, like water purification, like antibiotics, right? Because historically, even in war, disease, germs, viruses kill more people than bullets. So let's say you have whatever X is. X is the amount of weight, getting into some nerdy algebra stuff. If X is the amount of weight, you got to solve for X. If X for you is, 35 pounds for your gun and ammo loadout. You can carry more ammo with the 5.56 than you can do with the 308. But here is the issue. It may take 2 or 3 or 4 rounds, and this is not math, this is not scientific, this is from my decades of experience training, and it's a lot of anecdotal, right? And hopefully we never do a scientific test like this, but some people, it doesn't matter if you punch an X-ring hit right down the center, it hits their spine, it goes whatever, and they're an instant quadriplegic. They are out of the fight for the rest of their life, instantly, whether you shoot them with a 5.56 or a 308. Some people, this is not always true, but let's say you get a decent torso hit. Probably with one round of 308, that is it. It may take one round with a 223. It may take 2 or 3 or 4, and I think that is a reasonable assumption, just from, again, training and experience, and I would say what I know, but it's more of what I believe. I would say, and this is where we're getting into our first ratio. So the effective hit ratio. Yeah, you may be able to carry more rounds of 5.56, but if it takes maybe 2 or 3 or 4 rounds to neutralize a threat that's trying to kill you, at what point does that actually tip the scales back in favor of the 308? And is that worth it for you? Right? If you can carry twice as much ammo, but it takes 3 rounds where it would have taken 1 with the 308, then that math doesn't add up. Right? That's not a good equation. Just like you see and I'm not saying they're making the right choice on the caliber. I have zero experience firsthand with 277 Fury. But you look at them going from 30 rounds of 5.56 to 20 rounds in a magazine, just one magazine, mind you, of 277 Fury. You might think, well, that's silly, that's less. But going back to the war on terror, if you got to shoot somebody 2 or 3 or 4 times, or if they're hiding behind a mud wall and you got to empty half a magazine where you could do 2 or 3 rounds or 1 round with a more heavy caliber, the fact that you have more rounds is kind of a moot point. If every target you shoot requires multiple rounds, again, that math doesn't add up. And I gotta wonder how much of that going to 5.56 223 back in the Vietnam era was due to the draft and due to nothing against the men that went over there to Vietnam, but many men, especially of that era, were getting away from the country life and more people living in cities, and many of them were conscript soldiers, and that doesn't take away from them being heroes. That doesn't take away from them stepping up and doing what the country asked them to do. But it means that they didn't have years of professional soldiering experience before they went. So it was part of that an attempt at accuracy by volume, which in my experience does not work out super well. But I will concede that for some it has worked out well on like a near ambush, right? And in that scenario where you are, for common vernacular, spraying and praying, hoping that one round connects with something, trying to break contact, in that scenario, if that's what you're doing, then that favors the 5.56 over the 308. If you were going back to the rifleman's creeds, it's not the smoke that we make, the noise that we make, it's the hits that count. It's the hits that count. If you make a good hit and it's still not effective, that's kind of disheartening. I think in that scenario where you're making good hits, making good contact, then that favors the 308. So that's why there's so much debate. And this is not going to settle that debate, just spoiler alert here, because everybody's going to have their own opinions. And depending on your tactics and your environment plays a big part of this. But here's my unscientific kind of what I would consider a decent ratio. Again, sometimes it's going to be 1-1. If you get a good center round X-ring hit, punched center mass, it might do equally well either caliber, in which case why carry the more weight. But sometimes it may take 2, 3, or 4 rounds and decent torso hits with a 223 versus a 308. So if we use 308 as our 1, then that ratio for me is going to be somewhere between 1-2 or 1-3. If we're talking about this in like terms of a gear ratio. So I'm going to call it unscientifically like 1 to 2.75. I think that's a decent ratio. Now, these are some numbers from Luke, and by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, a matter is established. Do your own math. But you're never going to get solid numbers on this, and here's why. What loading are you using? What barrel are you using? Even if you're talking about just straight up 147 or 150 grain military NATO ball loading for 308, are you talking South African loading? Are you talking a UK loading? What loading are you talking about? And out of what barrel length? Are you talking about out of a FAL? Are you talking about out of an AR-10? Right, all that's going to make a difference. If you get your ballistics off the back of a box of ammo, that is really not scientific, because the odds that the rifle they tested with is going to shoot the same and have the same energy and the same numbers as your rifle, it would be just a random coincidence. It's probably not. It's probably not that close either. A lot of the numbers on boxes are, let's just say, to be polite, optimistic. That to say, I can't give you hard numbers because I don't know what rifle you're shooting it out of. I don't know what the kind of rifling it has. I don't know the twist rate. I don't know what temperature it's going to be where you're shooting. I don't know what elevation you're going to be shooting at. All that, talking about minutia, makes a difference in ballistics. But here's some numbers from Luke. And again, do your own due diligence here. But mathematically, 175 grain 308 at 2,500 feet per second would produce 21 KN, and a 55 grain 223 at 3,200 produces 11 KN. So if you look at that, that's 21 versus 11. That's close to double, and you're close to double the weight. And if you take the rough math that a 223 round weighs about half as much as a 308 round, then there you go. So if you do that survival caliber math, and if my ratio, which you may disagree with, is 1 to 2.75, even though you carry more rounds, in my opinion, if you're getting decent hits, then the survival math favors the 308. Here's some other survival math, and we'll talk about these other calibers a little bit more later. Just for comparison, a .22 long rifle produces 1.2 KN. So you need a minimum of 20 to 1 versus a 308. And he's talking about roughly, to get the same energy, you need 20 rounds of 22 to equal 1 round of 308. And some more survival math from him. Roughly 16 pounds of .22 long rifle equals 5 pounds of 308. In terms of providing the same amount of stopping force. Again, Luke did a lot of work here, and I want to commend him for his legwork. So 16 pounds of .22 long rifle equals 5 pounds of 308 for the same amount of power, if you're talking about pure power. And there's a couple of different, well, I'm the first to tell you that this does not always equate to effectiveness on target. There's a lot that goes into that. But if you're looking at, as far as physics go, force equals mass times velocity squared. If you want to do your own math on that, that is the formula generally referred to. Force equals mass times velocity squared. Now, Luke is Canadian, so he's using the metric system, which may or may not make sense to you. It doesn't really matter the units. I was telling him not to worry about that today because we use grains. Does that really make sense that you're using? That's how we weigh powder and bullets, is cereal grains. Like, what does a grain of barley or grain of wheat weigh? Does that really make a lot of sense? It doesn't matter as long as you get the ratios. I think the ratios are more important. And the ratios are going to be the same, depending on what numbers you use. But here's some numbers from a gift from another patron, Cartridges of the World. If we look at 308 Winchester, you're looking at 150 grains. If you go with 2800, that's a real standard vanilla loading. If you're looking at 150 at 2800, looking at 2612 for foot-pounds. We're talking foot-pounds now. It's 2612. And if you look at the 223, you're looking at, let's say, 55 grain at 3200. That's a pretty vanilla, pretty standard loading. You're looking at 1330. And there's nothing revolutionary here, right? You're talking about roughly, and this is rough numbers, roughly half the weight, roughly half the power. Now, here's the deal. Not everything is simple math. This is going back to, not everything is a 1-to-1 ratio. Here's a big example. This is a big reason why the 22 is so prized as a survival caliber option. Right? If I am shooting a quail, it doesn't matter that I have over 2,600 foot-pounds of energy in the 308. I don't want that much. More is not always more. So if I'm looking round per round, if what I'm mostly doing is hunting small game, then I don't want that much power. So the fact that it has way more power doesn't really matter. The fact that it has a higher power to weight ratio doesn't really matter because I don't want that much power. The whole point of me shooting it is so that I can eat it. So even in that, even though we'll get to power to weight ratio later, but even if I'm shooting a quail 22 long rifle versus 22 Magnum, even though the 22 mag has a higher power to weight ratio, I don't want the 22 mag because it's going to destroy more meat. Death does not come in degrees. Dead is dead. As long as I can shoot it and recover it, any extra power is superfluous to me. Superfluous meaning it's more than is necessary. It's like hitting a fly with a sledgehammer. Yeah, it killed the fly, but so would a fly swatter. Going on the other end, where it really may matter, let's say I'm trying to stop a vehicle ramming into camp, running over people. That's a real thing that happens, whether we're talking about today, normal times, or a half collapse or a full collapse scenario. Vehicle rammings, vehicle-borne IEDs are things we had to deal with in the Middle East. If you're trying to stop a vehicle, if I can stop, let's just say for argument's sake, and it's going to depend on the vehicle and where the hits are, but let's just say I think a good estimation number with 7.62x51 or 308, 2 good engine block hits will probably stop most passenger vehicles. it may take 4 or 8 rounds of 223, 5.56. Yes, even with green tip, because they're just not doing as much damage to that engine. If my goal is to stop that vehicle before it does major damage to me, loved ones, people I'm in charge of protecting, okay. What if it does take 8 rounds? Well, here's the big thing. What if I don't have time to put 8 rounds into that vehicle? No matter how fast you can do your double taps, you can get 2 rounds of 308 probably in a similar platform, let's say AR-10 versus AR-15. I can get 2 rounds into that engine block probably much faster than you can get 8 rounds into that engine block of 223. So for that survival math, that clearly favors a 308, right? Because I may not have time. If I only have time to get 3 rounds in, and that vehicle is stopped with the 308, but it is not stopped with the 5.56, and it, sadly kills half a dozen people, that math doesn't add up. Because it doesn't matter, even if the power to weight ratio is the same, even if it's half the power, half the weight, if I don't have time to get the number of rounds needed to stop that threat, right, that all the other stuff goes out the window. It's not as simple as just math. Here's another thing. If a guy is shooting at me trying to kill me, like bent on it, he is a radical Islamic terrorist wanting to kill people for jihad, and he's going to do it till his last breath. Maybe I don't have time to get several rounds in him before he detonates or whatever he's going to do. Maybe in that, again, favors the 308, but maybe not. Let's say we're talking about a more classic battlefield scenario where it's perhaps you and a couple of other people versus a battlefield full of several other people. Well, in that case, you may favor the 5.56 because you can get a round. I don't care how good you control recoil. If you reduce it, you control it better, and that's real math. Right, so it may be advantageous if those people especially are far away to get a round into a person and then continue on. If you have 8 targets, a dozen targets, to get a round in and then reevaluate. Going back to what we talked about before, maybe 1 round did the job. Maybe they take 3 or 4 rounds, but it's better to get 1 round into each target and then reassess. If you have multiple targets trying to kill you, then that survival math might favor the 223 because at least you're getting 1 round in them, which may slow them down to get 2nd, 3rd, 4th rounds into them. Whereas great, you might have got 1 round into the first guy with 308 and he stopped, but now 3 other guys are still shooting at you and one of them makes a hit on you. So, again, and you see the stickiness of the situation here. You see why there's so much debate. Getting back to that survival math and survival numbers. Here's a fascinating thing. Again, this is Luke. By the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, let a matter be established. Do your own math. I'd love to hear from you. You can contact me. Especially on Spotify, there's a thing where you can ask me questions. You can interact with me that way. But check your numbers for yourself. But these are Luke's numbers. This is talking about power to weight ratio, because after we talked about this in the Patreon chat, and we talk about more than I'm bringing up here, but we talked about power to weight ratio, and I thought it would be really interesting to find out power to weight ratio. Power to weight ratio. And again, this is going to be metric, but it doesn't really matter. The ratio will be the same, joules to grams. But the 5.7. 27 grain 5.7, 88 joules per gram. The 22 Magnum 40 grain, pretty standard loading, 106 joules per gram. The 5.56, 145 joules per gram. 147 grain 7.62 NATO, 145 joules per gram. We'll come back to that. The 123 grain 7.62 by 39, which heretofore we haven't really talked about, but 134 joules per gram. Fascinating numbers there. Here's what I thought was fascinating. I asked him if his numbers were right because I was kind of struck that the 55 grain really standard loading for 223 has 145 joules per gram. power to weight ratio. We talk about the 147 grain 7.62 NATO, a very standard, Breyer's vanilla loading, 145 joules per gram. Astounding, right? Same power to weight ratio. And the 123 grain 7.62 by 39, which is an intermediate cartridge, it's only slightly less at 134 joules per gram. Now, again, not everything is simple math, but those numbers are very intriguing. And here's the thing, 22 Magnum is very intriguing. It has a great power to weight ratio. You can carry a lot of it. It's got quite a bit more power than 22 long rifle, but here's the issue. There's nowhere near as many weapons chambered for it, especially reliable semi-autos. There are some, but not a lot. And a lot of the semi-autos that aren't very reliable. And that's not really the fault of the manufacturer of the gun. It's that if you look at 22 Magnum, and this is where it's more than just math and numbers on a page, it's got a really long, thin, straight case, which can bend, deform. It's also hard to feed properly, and it's a rimmed cartridge. All that makes it less reliable. So even though it might have a great power to weight ratio, many of the firearms that you might gravitate towards for a survival scenario would not be as reliable. And I would take a very reliable other cartridge even if it had a worse power to weight ratio. And here's where I want to get into a little subsection here, a little chapter, if you will, in this podcast about cheating the power to weight ratio. If you're talking about and these might, depending on your opinion on how ballistics works and velocity versus bullet mass and which one's more important, and that's been a big debate since probably before, but especially since Jack O'Connor and Elmer Keefe. Are you a big, heavy, slow bullet guy? Are you a super fast, punch a hole in both lungs, high velocity, flat shooting cartridge guy? But those numbers are fairly comparable if you're talking about a softer target, something like a good bonded cup and core bullet, or something maybe even better like a solid copper monolithic bullet, which punch well above their weight class. You can cheat a little bit. So don't think that everything boils down to numbers on a page, because you could have a 308 is a fantastic deer round, but you shoot a 308 with a full metal jacket at a deer, what could be a good stopping hit with a good hunting round, a good bonded cup and core round, that deer may get away and he may die. But if you don't find him, one, that's just irresponsible, I think, of managing the resources that God put here on this earth, because you're shooting it to eat it. And if in a survival scenario you're failing because you just wasted ammo and you didn't recover the game, the whole point of shooting it is to eat it. So there's more to it than just numbers on a page. So don't think that because it has more energy you should just run full metal jacket rounds, or that that's even a good choice. I don't want you to think that. Don't make the math more important than it is. You can really do things, especially if you tailor the ammunition to the task that you want it to do. I think if you're talking about hunting medium to large game, which I love to hunt, talking about like deer-sized game and up, I really, really would favor the 308. However, if I was going to use 223 for deer hunting, which I'm not a fan of, but it can be done. If I was doing that, I would really be diligent and gravitate towards like a solid copper monolithic bullet and make it cheat a little bit on that survival math. So don't think that it's just about numbers on a page. All right, so what's the right answer? All right, you probably know what I'm going to say. It depends. All right, what are you doing? And here's the thing for me. I tend to... Now, I'm not going to bury the lead here. When it talks about... If I'm talking about me, and not that you should take my advice all the time, and not that my answer is right for you. I'm not so vain as to think that I have the right answer for you. I don't know you. Unless you're one of the patrons, right? I probably don't know you at all. If it's me, living where I live, with my background and experience, if I have to pick one long gun for survival, it's not going to be a rifle at all. It's going to be a shotgun, which is a whole nother discussion. But if it has to be a rifle, I'm probably going to go 308. Probably going to go my Scar 17, if you give me no other caveats. Like, it's peanut butter and chocolate is hitting the fan, you got to grab a rifle. I'm probably going to gravitate towards a 308. with no other caveats. Now, I live out west. Since I got the freedom to move out west, since I joined the Marine Corps at 17 and got to see some more of the country, I really like it out west. I like talking about survival math. I did a whole episode on Alpha Male Podcast on the survival math of population density, which is a giant part of this equation. But there's a lot lower population density out here. If I were east of the Mississippi, which is where a vast majority of the listeners live, I'd probably gravitate towards a 223, talking about that multiple target environments. There's tons of people. Some states back east have hundreds of people per square mile, which that survival math just doesn't add up. Again, I did a whole other episode on that on Alpha Male Podcast. It's probably not going to be back too far in the feed. But if you're talking about that, if you're talking about I'm east of the Mississippi and stuff hits the fan, my first inclination, if I can, is to get west. Go west, young man. Hopefully you go west before anything bad happens. But if you don't, you got a lot more population. And if 10% of that population is doing really bad things and trying to kill other people, that's still a lot of people. In that kind of scenario, it may favor the 223, which is, I think, a big reason why it's so popular. If I have to bug out on foot, right, if everything I have to carry goes on my bag and I have to walk from the east coast to west of the Mississippi, and I would prefer west of the Missouri River. If I have to do that on my Lamborghinis, my leather personnel carriers, if I have to walk all that distance, it may favor the 22 long rifle. Because if I'm planning on no resupply ever, depending on the severity of the collapse, I can literally carry a lifetime supply of ammo with 22 long rifle. And I certainly don't want that in a gunfight, but it's certainly better than no gun, and I'd certainly rather have a 22 long rifle with ammo than a 308 with no ammo. But all other caveats, I tend to prefer, all other caveats aside, if you ask me to pick one, I'd probably pick 308. And that's me, for where I live. And if I did that, I might cheat and pick a sidearm, a handgun in 22. And that's me, a state pistol champion several times over, and I have done a lot of handgun hunting. I've taken more animals with a handgun than most people probably ever will with a rifle or a shotgun. And I'm not saying that to brag, I'm just saying that's my training and experience. I've taken, I don't know how many, even deer with a handgun. But if I had a 308 rifle, I might pair, that way I can carry a ton of ammo in 22 with the handgun. But you get the idea there, talking about cheating that survival math. Even though primarily, almost all the time, my general EDC concealed carry gun is a 9mm. There's a lot to this. You could get real nerdy down a lot of rabbit holes. You could get nerdy comparing, and I told Luke not to stress too much about it doing these numbers because, yeah, it does depend. You could have two 16-inch ARs and they could shoot the same box of ammo, the same bulk pack of Winchester white box, 55 grain ammo, at different velocities because they have different barreling twist rates, they have different rifling cutting, they have different bore diameters slightly, right? All that can just change the numbers. And you could go down some deep, dark rabbit holes. Could go down a dark rabbit hole. I wanted to not get too far in the weeds, but comparing like 77 grain Mark 262 to 55 grain XM193. Like, you can nerd out. People are often, I think, wondering how long I can keep making an episode a day as far as like getting new content. When you talk about the world of guns and ballistics, again, I could do a whole episode on, 5.56 55 grain versus 62 grain. And I could do a whole other episode on 62 grain versus 77 grain. I could do a whole episode on 55 grain and 16-inch barrel versus 20-inch barrel versus 18-inch barrel. Right? You get the idea. I don't, by God's grace, think I'll ever run out of content to do. But hopefully you find that content interesting. Hopefully you found this content interesting. If you did, this is just scratching the surface. If you want to be a deeper part of the tribe, if you want a group of like-minded men that iron sharpens iron and we help each other out, and we don't just talk about this stuff, we hopefully talk about more important stuff like theology, the Bible, things like that, where you can kind of open up and be a man like that and help each other out. Blessings are meant to be shared. Consider becoming a patron. There should be a Patreon link in the show notes. Consider becoming a patron. There's all kinds of Patreon-only insider content. I did a very similar nerdy ballistics episode like this about different shotgun loads and different shotguns and chokes and stuff like that, just for the patrons. It just came out 25 minutes ago, I believe, on Patreon. There's tons of stuff like that on Patreon that never sees the light of day on this regular podcast. So if you don't want to miss out on that content, you want to be blessed by being a part of a really cool group, consider becoming a patron. Alright, with that, your tactical tip of the day. A go-to load for the 308 for me, and it has been for years out of many different guns. Guns are individualistic. Just because I have done well with this load as a professional big game hunter and guide, it was one of my go-to loads for 308. When I was the commander of a tactical team to stop active shooters, it was one of my go-to loads for 308. It shoots lights out. It shoots crazy good out of my Scar 17. It shoots really good out of a number of 308s. And that's Federal High Shock 150 grain. It's what I would call a Walmart load. And it's a very affordable load. And it's not just a full metal jacket load. It's a good hunting load. It's a good cup and core soft lead tip bullet, it's a really affordable load, and it shoots really well. It's much better in my experience as far as ballistics performance go. It's so much better, and it's not a lot more money than, especially today, where there's not a glut of surplus 7.62 ammo. So again, cheat a little bit on that survival math. Get a really good bullet construction and a really good accurate load. And I believe they're all sealed also for moisture. Like the primer pockets and stuff are sealed against moisture and oil and stuff like that. It's a fantastic load. I'm not saying that your rifle's going to like it, but I'm saying it's probably a good place to start. And for a place to start on 5.56, the Hornady Frontier 55 grain boat tip hollow point match. It is a phenomenal, not as cheap as some bulk stuff, but really if you want a little bit of step up in price and a giant leap forward in performance, you might look at that Hornady Frontier 55 grain boat tip hollow point match. It's a good go-to load for me. Again, your rifle may or may not like it. Rifles are individualistic. Just like people. Some people like spicy food, some don't. Some rifles like 55 grain, some 5.56 rifles like 55 grain, some like 62 grain, some will like a different 55 grain over another. But I think those are good recommendations to start with, and I'm not sponsored by any ammo companies, any gun companies, so you're getting a straight dope here on that. I'm not saying your rifle's going to like it, but they're good places to start. Oh, also for tactical tips, so before I forget, I should roll it into this episode. Even if you don't reload, a good resource to have, tactical tip, find an old used reloading manual on eBay, on Amazon, at a used bookstore. Unless you're talking about you want data on the most state-of-the-art loads. Many of these loads have been around a long time. Just find an old reloading data book, and that will give you probably a much deeper understanding, if you're nerdy enough to study it, on different calibers. And kind of strip away some of that marketing hype. Also a good resource, Ballistics by the Inch, if you want to look that up. It's a little bit older, but it's got some good data on there too if you like the ballistics data stuff, if you don't know about that. Ballistics by the Inch. With that, let's roll into the tactical verse of the day. I think for today I'm going to recite Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. You lead me in the paths of righteousness for your name's sake. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup runs over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Men, there are things much more important than guns and calibers and ballistics. Those things are all temporary and fading away. And one day, whatever happens, good times or bad in this world, in your individual world, one day we'll all face the judgment seat of Christ. Let's keep our eye on what's really important. Let's keep God at the center of our life. Thanks for listening, and have a blessed day.